Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Dark Souls II Dissected. For today's episode, I wanted to look back at some timed events you can no longer experience. And in fact, if you never played the original Dark Souls 2 before early 2015, or only ever played the Scholar of the First Sin re-release, you might not even know this existed. And there's some weapons you've probably never gotten your hands on either. So today we're going to take a close look at the Majula Mansion chest. So, in the basement of the Majula Mansion, there's a chest that contains a soul vessel. It's always contained a soul vessel by default, but this chest was also used to gift special items during timed events. You had to be online for the server to update the chest, and thankfully these items weren't mutually exclusive with the soul vessel that's normally in there. You just had to reload the area to get the chest to reclose, and spawn whichever remaining item was available. You could also get the special items multiple times if you started new characters, since their availability was specific to every save slot you had. It wasn't like a one-time thing for your entire profile. Conceptually, it feels like a twist on the Lost and Found chest from Dark Souls 1. That chest served a very different purpose, but the game never tells you what it's for, and so it's just kind of a weird, mysterious thing to a lot of players. So the idea of putting a chest in the game's hub, that usually sits there empty for most of your playthrough, but sometimes can get more stuff in it, is something of a trope from Software. It's niche enough to not have its own TV Tropes article, but trust me, it is a thing. We haven't seen it in most of their games since Dark Souls 2, but it did return to Sekiro in the form of the Offering Box. So don't be surprised if it shows up again in another From Software game in the future. Okay, so you're probably wondering what was actually offered, and when. In early April of 2014, a little under a month after the game originally released on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, the chest was updated to carry a Divine Blessing, and it was in there for about a week. The Divine Blessing becoming available wasn't something that was announced. They just sort of surprised and confused some players without saying anything. I suspect it was simply a test run from the developers. Then a couple months later, in early June of 2014, the DLC was announced, with the first chapter slated to come out near the end of July. And to fill this wait time, the Majula Mansion chest was used as a sort of promotional campaign that was to be updated with new items every week. From Software also launched the Treasure Box webpage to announce the timeline and contents of chest updates. On June 5th of 2014, it was set to contain 3 Petrified Somethings. Then the next week, it had 2 Twinkling Titanite. On the third week, it had 5 Cracked Red-Eye Orbs. Then there were 4 Bonfire Ascetics the week after that. On the 5th week, it carried a Poison Stone and Bleed Stone. I find these to be some of the more interesting lead-up items, because of how they gave you a couple extra sources of infusion right at the start of the game, especially if you started a new character during this time. After that, it was 3 Elizabeth Mushrooms and 3 Wilted Dusk Herbs. And for the penultimate item, it was 5 Smooth and Silky Stones. But the last item was the one thing they didn't announce in advance, simply referring to it as a secret item. And to relive that moment of surprise, here's a clip from Grohlvana documenting it back then.
Yeah, you were probably as confused as I was when you got the Murakumo in the chest, because you can get this weapon in the game already. The difference is this one has a different colored blade and hilt, although it has the same description and stats.
Yeah, so this whole thing culminated in a few different weapon reskins, which I'll talk more about in a second, but it's fun to look back at some of the expectations from the community. I like this Reddit post that guesses the secret item was going to be a pendant, which was probably somewhat a joke and only half serious, but if you're not familiar, the pendant from Dark Souls 1 was an item that used to have a lot of mystery and speculation about it. And then also there was the Broken Pendant, another item involved with accessing the DLC of that game. So it's understandable that people might have been expecting something similar being needed again to access the brand new DLC of Dark Souls 2. The top voted comment suggested a Mimic, which would have been hilarious. And also I see someone mentioning the Barrel, which is some fascinating and weird cut content, so understandably there was some hope that it was going to make it into the game. But in the end, we got weapon reskins, which, as Grohlvana mentioned before, had the exact same stats, names, and item descriptions. They were identical in every way, aside from having a different texture. Oh, and their icons could be different as well. The first was the Blue Murakumo, which earned the community nickname of Blue Rakumo. Then after that, the weekly updates stopped, with just a couple more weapon reskins being released with 2-week windows at the launch of the next 2 DLCs. There was a reskinned Black Steel Katana, which is referred to by the community as the White Steel Katana, and this is the one I actually used the most back in the day. And then there was the reskinned Longsword, sometimes known as the Blue Longsword or Moonlight Longsword. Then after that, there was roughly a half-year gap until February of 2015, when the Scholar of the First Sin DLC released. I'll talk more about the ramifications of this in a second, but bear in mind that there is a distinction between the DLC and the actual Scholar of the First Sin re-release. The release of this DLC was our last hurrah for the Majula Mansion chest. It gave us a 1-week window in early 2015 to get special items from the chest for the last time. And to relive that moment, here's some footage from BlueLizardJello.
Hey everyone, BlueLizardJello here, and I have another PSA for you. Do you remember those reskinned weapons that we got a while ago back when the DLC was coming out? Well, they're back. And not only are they back, but they've also added a Grey Club, and this Grey Club has a bloody texture to it.
So yeah, it was a second chance to get the 3 previous reskins, so you could power stance them if you got them before. And then also we got the new Great Club, known as the Bloodied Great Club. So I think From Software was very careful in choosing weapon reskins as their special items. For the collector who wants everything, there'll be items you want to have, and it's kind of cool to have a few variations of existing weapons, simple as they may be. But it's clear to me that they really didn't want to go the extra mile and make completely unique weapons or armor available from this chest, since missing out on something more major like that would probably be a bigger point of contention from the player base. So they did their best to think of something as middle of the road as they could, something more interesting than random consumables you can get elsewhere, but something not as offensive as completely unique gear if you miss it. Speaking of which, the Demon's Souls remake for the PlayStation 5 did do something like that, which sucks. They added a new weapon called the Reaper Scythe, which was only available if you pre-ordered the game. Feel free to sound off in the comments what you think of these kinds of practices. I personally think it's incredibly lame, especially because of how difficult it's been to get a PS5, even to this day, so a lot of people missed out on this. But that's not to say that Dark Souls 2 didn't also drop the ball in a kind of spectacular way here. Remember that I said that the last batch of items were offered in February of 2015, for the release of the Scholar of the First Sin DLC. This was a patch that added the Aldia character and boss, and was otherwise just a general update with some balancing and quality of life fixes, for the original version of the game. The actual full re-release of Dark Souls 2, also known as Scholar of the First Sin, wasn't released until a month later, several weeks after the final chest event had ended. That's right, what's supposed to be the enhanced and definitive version of Dark Souls 2 never bothered to make use of this mechanic. The definitive version of Dark Souls 2 is missing 4 weapons that you could have only gotten your hands on legitimately in the original version of the game. Say what you will of timed releases as an overall concept, but the fact that it's something they actually put into the game, but then didn't bother to use it at any point in the lifespan of Scholar of the First Sin, is really unfortunate. The idea of being able to have the server update the contents of the chest is interesting, but it looks like they were only ever interested in using it as a promotional tool for DLC, so it died with the last major update. So, without any major events beyond the launch of the re-release, when should they have done it? For starters, I think the launch itself would have been a good time. Like a quasi-pre-order bonus, but instead of actually needing to pre-order, you just would have needed an internet connection and the game within the first week it was out or whatever. But I think it's interesting to look back at the only other timed events in Soulsborne history, which happened in Demon's Souls. Thankfully, the original Demon's Souls didn't get any unique content behind timed events, but its world tendency mechanic would average your own world tendency with some kind of average from the entire player base. Basically, the server would send some number to your game to steer your world tendency towards some hidden average, which is why people recommended playing offline if you wanted to carefully manage your world tendency. This was a questionable design choice in and of itself, but the cool part is that on special occasions, they'd override the community averages to plunge your game into pure black or pure white world tendency. Seriously, they'd make your game pure black on Halloween and pure white on Christmas. It was cool as hell. Now, I could understand maybe shifting from Christmas to something a bit more generic like New Year's if you wanted to be more inclusive, or perhaps even something like an anniversary of the game's launch. But looking at how Demon's Souls had these weird little holidays, the chest from Dark Souls 2 not getting a similar treatment feels like a missed opportunity. Heck, there's even the community-organized Return to Drangleic events. Not that I expect them to recognize and sync up with the community in this way, but it certainly would have been cool. I think the last time it could have been used for a major event would have been the release of the Dark Souls Trilogy collection in 2018, but of course that also came and went without anything happening. Surely, the game is far past the point of this feature ever being considered for use again, but I do see one small blip of an opportunity on the horizon. Which is why I'm launching a petition for them to use the chest one last time for Scholar of the First Sin, when the PC servers come back online. No, this isn't a joke. The petition is live right now, and I've linked it in the video description, and it would mean a lot if you signed it and left some friendly words of encouragement to Bandai Namco and From Software. I'm well aware that this is a pretty absurd thing to do. The game is over 8 years old, and it's been over 7 years since the last update. The people who would ultimately be responsible for modifying the chest back then, of course, have different responsibilities now. But this far out into the game's lifespan, if there ever was a time where someone might be getting reacquainted with the servers, surely it's while they're down for the unexpected maintenance they've had to deal with. And the servers coming back online for the PC version would certainly be an event worth celebrating. Oh, and by the way, there were 3 more weapon reskins that were left in the game as cut content. There was also a black rapier, a golden great axe, and a red cestus, which never got released. So this could also be the last possible attempt to get them in the game legitimately. Again, I know it's a long shot, and I'm not really hopeful that this will work. I'm also aware that I'm not some YouTuber with like a massive audience, but it couldn't hurt to try. I think it's been years since anyone at From Software or Bandai Namco have thought about this mechanic, and if we can get together to remind them that it even exists, that it was the only way to get a few weapons which never made it into Scholar of the First Sin, and that there's even a few more remaining reskins they could roll out, well, the remote chance of any of this happening becomes slightly better if we get together and politely request it. So before we end the video, I would be remiss not to mention the Majula Monument, the one other place a few timed events existed in Dark Souls 2. Thankfully no real content was gated behind this, but you know how there's that cryptic message on the back that says, "The letters are worn beyond recognition"? Well, it didn't always say that. This was also temporarily used to mark the arrival of the DLCs, giving hints on how to access them. For Crown of the Sunken King, it said, "Seek the land of an ancient king, in the Black Gulch, deep below." For Crown of the Old Iron King, it said, "Seek the land of an ancient king, past the Iron Keep, upon a sea of flame." And for Crown of the Ivory King, it said, "Seek the land of an ancient king, sealed away, at the Shrine of Winter." So they were all pretty mundane messages in the end, but we did get some tantalizing weirdness in the Portuguese language version. Bear with me as I embarrass myself with the pronunciation, but it says, "Os gigantes cruzaram os mares, talvez para voltar para casa." This is a translation of this bit of unused text, which said, "Giants crossed the seas, perhaps in homecoming." It seems like they simply made a mistake and translated the wrong line of text, and the only reason this was new at any point in the game's lifespan was because Portuguese wasn't added until patch 104. There's not much to glean from it, but it's still tantalizing seeing a bit of lore show up at the Majula obelisk. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting. It helps immensely. You can also support me on patreon.com/illusorywall. And an extra special thanks to all of my backers at the Evil Vagrant tier. Basileus, Gary Marshall, Kakaruma, Carl Germ, Kiko Abad, Chris, Lazy Tangent, Lude Frago, Nashwan Nazari, Nate Hines, Quinn Parsons, Ronax, the Majalis Duo, Sinatu, and Zelther. I'd also like to thank Verdai, Moonlight Ruin, and Half-Grown Hollow, just in general for being the folks I'm starting to run to for more technical questions about Dark Souls 2. The game is being broken apart now more than ever, and if you use Twitter, these are people you'll definitely want to follow if you're interested in seeing cool Dark Souls 2 stuff. Also, please consider signing that petition. Even if it doesn't work out, it's literally our only chance at seeing this mechanic resurrected one last time. So I hope that's motivation enough. Thanks for watching.